Hi, my name is Premjo.
My name is Mankirat.
My name is Harvey.
And my name is Balraj.
Our passion project will be centered around concussions. We will discuss the physics and physiological aspects of concussions, as well as talk about the leading technologies used to prevent this type of brain trauma.
What is a concussion? Concussions are the most common types of traumatic brain injury, also known as minor head trauma or mild traumatic brain injury. It is usually defined as a head injury with a temporary loss of brain function. A concussion results in an altered mental state that may include becoming unconscious. A concussion is different from a contusion. A concussion specifically affects your brain, but contusions are bruises. Contusions can occur on your head, but they aren't typically serious and tend to resolve within days. Causes of concussion. A concussion is usually caused by a blow to the head or body, a fall, or another injury that jars or shakes the brain inside the skull. Although there may be cuts or bruises on the head or face, there may be no other visible signs of brain injury. You don't have to lose consciousness to have a concussion. Some people will have obvious symptoms of a concussion, such as passing out or forgetting what happened right before the injury, but other people won't. With the rest, most people fully recover from a concussion. Some people recover within a few hours, other people take a few weeks to recover.
Anatomy of the brain as related to concussion. Your brain is a soft organ that is surrounded by spinal fluid and protected by your hard skull. Normally, the fluid around the brain acts like a cushion that keeps your brain from banging into your skull. But if your head or body is hit hard, your brain can crash into your skull and be injured. During a severe impact, the spinal fluid is unable to protect the brain from the collision into the skull.
In this video, we will be walking you through how the impact of a concussion damages your brain at the microscopic level. Your brain is the most fragile organ in the body with the same texture and consistency as gelatin. The skull provides a hard protective shell around the brain. A watery substance called cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid cushions the brain against impact with the wall of the skull during everyday head movements. This cushioning effect protects the billions of nerve cells called neurons inside the brain. Each neuron communicates with other neurons through electrical signals that travel down a long thread-like extension called an axon. A hard blow to the head can cause the brain to strike the inside of the skull. During the impact, the brain squeezes against the inside of the skull, sending shockwaves throughout the brain. These shockwaves tear or stretch the axons of some neurons. This trauma is called diffuse axonal injury or axonal shearing. The damaged axons reduce normal brain functions by interrupting communications between the neurons.
We will now be playing a scientific video which contains fascinating yet factual information and an insight on the magnitude of concussions in sports. You will notice the video will often mention the unit g. To clarify, the g does not necessarily represent acceleration due to gravity. The g represents a form of acceleration that causes the accelerating object to experience a force acting in the opposite direction to the acceleration.
Every year, over 100,000 concussions occur in all levels of football, and 60% of these are from head-to-head collisions. In an impact lasting just 15 milliseconds, a player's head, on average, experiences almost 100 Gs of force, and collisions on special teams can result in forces of up to 190 Gs. In the NFL, the average speed of a head-to-head impact, the velocity of both heads combined, is 20 miles per hour, with the struck player's head decelerating 14 miles per hour. According to studies done by Sports Science's chief medical advisor, Dr. Basil Eich, this 15 millisecond impact is equivalent to getting smashed in the head with a sledgehammer.
Long-term symptoms. Most concussions and other mild traumatic brain injuries, MTBIs, should completely resolve within 1 to 6 weeks. Some people, however, experience post-concussion syndrome, PCS, with symptoms lasting longer than this. Post-concussion syndrome can include physical, cognitive, and emotional problems including long-term memory loss, headache, dizziness, difficulty concentrating or completing tasks, irritation, or the sense that you just don't feel like yourself.
Symptoms pertaining to areas affected: not thinking clearly, confusions, headaches, memory loss, inability to focus and concentrate, irritability, depression, nausea and vomiting, dizziness, dazed or stunned, fuzzy or blurry vision, sensitivity to light or noise. In the first image seen, any area of the brain affected will cause confusion and headaches. If the temporal lobe is affected, memory loss will most likely occur. Irritability, depression, and the inability to concentrate will most likely occur if the occipital lobe is affected. If the brainstem is impacted, nausea and vomiting, dizziness, and becoming dazed will most likely occur. Fuzzy or blurry vision and sensitivity to light or noise will most likely occur when the frontal lobe is impacted.
Physics involved in concussions. We will now be moving on to the physics side of concussions. We will be covering the kinematics, Newton's laws, momentum, and forces aspect of concussions. Kinematics. To understand the dynamics of a concussion, concepts from kinematics must be applied. To elaborate, it is the sudden acceleration and deceleration of the individual which causes the brain to jolt and impact the inside of the skull. The magnitudes of these accelerations and decelerations can be calculated using a variety of physics formulas. The sudden deceleration that immediately follows the acceleration causes a strong impact force. Equation that illustrates this concept is A equals Vf squared minus Vi squared divided by 2 dg. Because the final velocity is often considered to be 0 meters per second, as the individual is assumed to be brought to a halt, the equation would then be A equals negative Vi squared divided by 2 dg.
Now, a kinematic example. We would now like to walk you through an example equation using the kinematics formulas we made you familiar with in the previous slide. If a 90 kilogram running back is running down the field at 4.568 meters per second, then suddenly stops, his head is brought to a stop in a distance of 0.121 meters. What force does his head exert? We can start by listing the values that we know. First, V2 equals 4.568 meters per second. Gravity is 9.8, which is a constant. The distance he took to stop is 0.121 meters. The mass of the running back is 90 kilograms. And we can start substituting these given values into the kinematics equation that we are able to calculate the value of the acceleration in g units. As shown right here, A equals negative V1 squared over 2dg, and the acceleration comes to 8.789. Now we can then use a simple F net equals ma formula to calculate the force exerted by the head in newtons. F equals ma, we already have our mass of the running back, which is 90 kilograms. We found out the acceleration, so we multiply those two, and then we get the answer of 7,760 newtons, and that's the force that it exerted onto the head of the running man.
Newton's first law of motion. Newton's first law states an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. The brain will stay in inertia until an external force acts on it, because it is suspended inside your skull. There is a fraction of a second when your body is in movement due to the external force from the sudden acceleration, deceleration movements, but your brain is still in inertia. When your head is jerked, the cerebrospinal fluid is pushed aside as your skull travels and comes into contact with your brain, acting as the force causing the brain itself to move, which then extends to Newton's second law.
Newton's second law. The simplest law that applies to concussions is the second law of motion. The force that the skull exerts on the brain depends on its mass and initial acceleration. However, during a concussion, there is not one single impact that occurs. The brain can collide with the skull multiple times in different areas. In linear impacts, when the skull strikes the brain, it causes the brain to accelerate in the direction of which the force was applied. This is called a Cope injury. As the brain travels across your skull, it will come into contact with the opposite side of your skull. This is called the counter Cope injury, as it is a result of the counter blow of the head.
Newton's third law states, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. As the brain accelerates towards and eventually hits the opposite side of the skull, it bounces off the skull's inner surface. This is explained by Newton's third law. The force applied by the brain onto the skull is met with an equal but opposite reaction force of the skull acting upon the brain. Because the skull has a greater mass, the reaction force exerted on the brain is much greater, causing the brain to ricochet off. The same concept is applied upon initial impact where the skull first hits the brain. The mass of the brain is smaller than the skull's, thus causing the brain to accelerate in a given direction of the net force. This is the same concept as a ball hitting a wall and bouncing back. Because the mass of the wall is much greater than the mass of the ball, it does not move, but it does exert an equal amount of force onto the ball as the ball exerts onto the wall. Another aspect we must not forget is the role of momentum involved in concussion. The brain inside the skull experiences momentum as a force is exerted upon it. The manner in which the force is applied will cause the motion of the brain within the skull to vary. We will now be accessing a virtual demo to further explain our point. In a direct impact to the head, the momentum causes an impact in two places of the skull, leading to a change in brain function. This essentially will trigger the concussion signs and symptoms. On the other hand, in an indirect impact, a whiplash motion is created. The head will first snap towards the direction of the collision and then move in the opposite direction, as seen in the diagram.
The last physics aspect is forces. The greater the mass of player A traveling at a higher acceleration, the greater the force will be when coming into contact with player B, whose mass and acceleration is smaller than player A's. F equals ma. How to reduce chances of concussions. We will now be shifting from the explanation of concussions to concussion prevention. To reduce the chances of concussion, this criteria must be met. Reduce the deceleration of the skull and hence the brain movement by managing the impact. Have a soft material that absorbs some of the impact and therefore the head comes to a halt more slowly. Spread the forces of the impact over a greater surface area so that they are not concentrated on particular areas of the skull. Prevent direct contact between the skull and the impacting object by acting as a mechanical barrier between the head and the object. Helmets meet the points of the criteria shown in the last slide.
A helmet can prevent or minimize injury to the head and brain. A protective shield that will check all the criteria points to reduce the chances of concussions. First step in preventing injury is to minimize the chances of crashing or being hit.
How do helmets work? Helmets designed to handle major crash energy generally contain a layer of crushable foam. When you crash and hit a hard surface, the foam part of a helmet crushes, controlling the crash energy and extending your head's stopping time by about 6 milliseconds to reduce the peak impact to the brain. Rotational forces and internal strains are likely to be reduced by the crushing. In a lab test, graphs of the impact energy that the brain sees look like this, with a smooth curve extending over 6 milliseconds for the good helmet. The picture below represents the impact experienced by the brain when the skull is not protected by a helmet. Such enormous amounts of impacts experienced by the brain can cause short-term and long-term damage when such accidents occur multiple times.
Vice's 01 is the most revolutionary football helmet on the market today. With its groundbreaking innovation and advancements, this helmet is the most secure and comfortable. Vice's 01 is known to have a flexible shell, which is unusual when it comes to the football helmets used in the NFL today. The flexible shell will allow this helmet to be the first helmet to be able to deform in order to reduce and stop the large amounts of momentum traveling to the skull. By taking into consideration that hits and impacts will come from all sides, the whole helmet is protected with hundreds of small flexible rods in the flexible outer layer of the helmet. As the helmet is hit, the small rods will then stop the impact from reaching the skull by deforming alongside other rods to control the forces acting upon them. Once the momentum is stopped, the small rods and the outer shell goes back to its regular shape. The helmet will not lose its strength as long as it's hit with reasonable amounts of force as expected in football or less. The front mask is made out of metal which protects the face from impacts such as swinging hands. Shatterproof visors can also be mounted onto the front of the mask to further protect the eyes from impacts like swinging fingers.
Increase in awareness. Mild concussions in sports have gained a huge amount of attention in the last few years. The NFL and other sport leagues have been developing better and accurate return to play checklists, applying the physics to group injury types, injury seriousness, and outcomes may further develop concussion management techniques and prevention strategies. This will conclude our screencast. We hope you enjoyed and learned a thing or two about concussion. Thank you.